A Soviet cosmonaut died in a fire before anyone reached space, and his own government spent 25 years making sure the world never found out his name existed. You've heard about the Apollo 1 fire. You've heard about the Challenger and Columbia disasters. But the deaths that happened before liftoff in sealed chambers on remote launch pads above the Mojave Desert were handled differently. No press conferences, no national mourning, just quiet erasure, and governments that had every reason to keep it that way. 3 men, 3 programs, 3 cover-ups that held for decades. And the first one didn't just kill a cosmonaut. The secrecy around it may have directly caused the deaths of 3 more men, 6 years later, on the other side of the world. That's not speculation. By the end of this, you'll see exactly how the chain connects. But first, you need to know who Valentin Bondarenko was, because his government spent 25 years ensuring you wouldn't. Case 1. Valentin Bondarenko. Valentin Bondarenko was a Soviet fighter pilot selected in 1960 for training as a cosmonaut. He was 24 years old, the youngest of the first batch of cosmonauts. He had a wife named Anya, a 5-year-old son, and a spot in the most exclusive club on Earth. 20 people were chosen out of the entire Soviet military. Bondarenko was one of them. He was weeks away from potentially flying in space. March 23, 1961, was the 10th day of a 15-day endurance experiment in a low-pressure altitude chamber at the Institute of Biomedical Problems in Moscow. The chamber atmosphere was at least 50% oxygen. The idea was to simulate the conditions inside a spacecraft, isolated, pressurized, and oxygen-rich, and see how a human body held up. Bondarenko had been in there for 10 days. He was almost done. Having completed work for the day, he removed monitoring biosensors from his body and washed his skin with an alcohol-soaked cotton ball, which he then discarded. The cotton ball landed on an electric hot plate, which he was using to brew a cup of tea. The cotton ignited, and Bondarenko tried to smother the flames with the sleeve of his woolen coveralls, which caught fire in the chamber's oxygen-rich atmosphere. In a normal environment, that might have been manageable. But this was not a normal environment. Under high oxygen concentration, normally non-flammable substances can burn vigorously. His suit went up almost instantly. Because of the pressure difference, it took an onlooking doctor nearly half an hour to open the chamber door. Releasing the pressure through bleed valves took at least several minutes. And for all that time, Bondarenko was engulfed in flames. Bondarenko's clothing burned until almost all the oxygen in the chamber was used up, and he had suffered 3rd-degree burns over most of his body, as well as losing both of his eyes. When he was dragged out of the pressure chamber, he was still conscious and kept repeating, "It was my fault. No one else is to blame." He died 8 hours later from the shock of the burns. Now, here is where it gets darker. The Soviet government didn't just grieve quietly. They erased him. The Soviet government airbrushed out the cosmonaut's image from an official 1961 photograph of the first 6 cosmonauts selected for training, while British researcher Rex Hall showed that 5 people had been erased from an earlier group photograph of 16 cosmonauts. Clumsy attempts were later made to further doctor the historic photographs, with the insertion of imaginative but non-existent photo details to account for the absence of the original members of the group. They didn't just hide his death, they rewrote the photographs. They rebuilt the visual record of history to make it look like he had never existed. The Soviet government publicly acknowledged the death of cosmonaut trainee Valentin Bondarenko for the first time in April 1986. 25 years after he died. The disclosure appeared in an article by aviation journalist Yaroslav Golovanov in the state-run newspaper Izvestia. And even then, it only came out because the political climate had shifted. The acknowledgement coincided with Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of Glasnost, or openness, which encouraged greater transparency about historical events. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. Bondarenko's death was caused by fire in a sealed high-oxygen environment, which also befell the crew of Apollo 1. There was some later speculation that had the Soviets been open about the circumstances of Bondarenko's death, NASA might have been alerted to the hazardous design of the early Apollo command module and would have made changes which could have prevented the 1967 deaths of the 3 Apollo 1 crew members. That is the weight of what secrecy costs. 3 more men, 6 years later, possibly dying because of a cover-up that started in a Moscow pressure chamber with a cotton swab and a hot plate. Valentin Bondarenko's name was not on the Apollo 15 plaque left on the moon because his death had not been revealed at the time. The astronauts who died in flight got memorials. Bondarenko got a photo edit. Keep that in mind, because the next case is even worse in scale, and the cover-up was even more brazen. Case 2, the Nedelin Catastrophe. On October 24, 1960, at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in the Kazakh SSR, preparations were underway for the first test flight of a prototype R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile. This wasn't a space mission, this was a weapons program. But the people who died here were the same engineers and technicians who built and supported Soviet rocketry, the same infrastructure that put cosmonauts in orbit. So when this pad exploded, it didn't just kill people, it tore a hole in the entire program. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin was an ambitious military leader who rose to command the Soviet Union's strategic missile forces during the Cold War. In the autumn of 1960, his main focus was developing the new R-16 intercontinental ballistic missile, which was meant to be an answer to the American Atlas. According to Soviet rocket designer Boris Chertok, work on the R-16 was proceeding ahead of schedule, with a target date of July 1961 for the first launch, when Nedelin upped the ante. He would launch by November 7th, in time for the 43rd anniversary of the Soviet Revolution. That decision is what killed them. Nedelin's insistence on performing tests before November 7th resulted in extreme schedule pressure, with numerous safety procedures being ignored in order to save time. Rushing the schedule led exhausted workers to take all kinds of shortcuts and risks, including continuing to work on the missile after it was fully fueled on the launch pad at Baikonur, with about 250 people milling around within close range. Nedelin was so confident in a successful outcome that he positioned himself merely a few meters from the rocket, instilling confidence in those around him. The engineers kept working, and then a short circuit in the replaced main sequencer caused the second stage engines, while being tested before launch, to fire inadvertently. This detonated the first stage fuel tanks directly below, destroying the missile in an enormous explosion. People near the rocket were instantly incinerated. Those farther away were burned to death or poisoned by the toxic fuel component vapors. The hypergolic propellants ignited, producing a massive fireball that scorched a wide area, melted scaffolding and tar on the pad, and generated temperatures up to 3,000 degrees Celsius at the epicenter. The fire persisted for about 2 hours, complicating immediate access to the site. A 1994 State Commission report gave the death toll as 78, including 74 killed at the site and 4 who later died in hospital. Other estimates have varied. Some accounts place the total considerably higher. Marshal Nedelin was near the base of the missile at the time of the explosion and perished in the blast. As rocket designer Boris Chertok wrote, "The majority of the dead were unrecognizable. Nedelin was identified by the Gold Star medal that had survived. And then came the lie. Soviet authorities suppressed information about the disaster for decades and falsely reported that Chief Marshal Nedelin had died in an air crash. Relatives of the victims were instructed to attribute the loss to a plane crash. Dozens of families told to lie, told to say their husbands and sons and fathers died in a routine accident somewhere in the sky on an undisclosed mission. There's a detail from the aftermath that is almost hard to believe. The investigation commission found that many more people were present on the launch pad than should have been. Most were supposed to be safely off-site in bunkers. According to Sergei Khrushchev, Brezhnev insisted that the commission punish no one, explaining that the guilty have already been punished, meaning the dead. The guilty were already dead. The Soviet Union did not acknowledge the events publicly until April 16, 1989, when a report appeared in the weekly news magazine Ogoniok. Nearly 3 decades of silence, and this incident remains the deadliest single accident in the history of rocketry and space exploration. Most people have never heard of it. Now, here is the one that almost nobody realizes carries the same weight as the others, because it happened in America, in broad daylight, and was still quietly buried for years. Case 3. Michael Adams and the X-15. The North American X-15 was a hypersonic rocket-powered aircraft that was part of the X-plane series of experimental aircraft, jointly operated by the U.S. Air Force and NASA. It was the most advanced aircraft ever flown. It set speed and altitude records that still stand. And it was the proving ground for everything that came after: the materials, the re-entry data, the flight profiles that eventually got humans to the moon. On November 15, 1967, Major Michael J. Adams flew X-15 Flight 191 aboard the X-15-3, one of 3 planes in the X-15 fleet. This was his 7th flight in an X-15. His wife, Frida, and his mother, Georgia Adams, were visiting in the NASA control room at Edwards Air Force Base. They were there to watch him fly. Adams reached 266,000 feet and Mach 5.2. He had crossed the boundary of space by the U.S. Air Force definition, 50 miles up. The flight was going well, and then it wasn't. During the climb-out, an electrical disturbance from an onboard experiment caused a transient motion in 3 control system servo actuators, deactivating the normal reaction control system. When the aircraft had reached its maximum altitude, it was off-heading by 15 degrees to the left. Adams was at the edge of space, moving at 5 times the speed of sound, and the aircraft was beginning to drift sideways without him fully realizing it. Unnoticed, the airplane's heading began to deviate from the direction of flight as the reaction controls functioned intermittently. Adams, possibly disoriented, made control inputs that increased the heading error. Soon, the aircraft was flying sideways. In the NASA control room, there was no way to monitor the heading of the aircraft, so the situation was unknown to the engineers monitoring the flight. As he became aware of his predicament, Adams reported to ground control that the aircraft seemed squirrely. The heading drift increased while the X-15 was traveling at Mach 5 at an altitude of 230,000 feet. Finally recognizing his situation, Adams reported to ground personnel that "I'm in a spin." No pilot had ever experienced a hypersonic spin, and ground control was powerless to offer advice. There was no recovery procedure, there was no precedent. Through some combination of piloting skills and the airplane's inherent stability, Adams managed to recover from the spin at 120,000 feet. He found himself in an inverted dive, and the X-15 soon developed a self-sustaining pitch oscillation that saturated the flight control system. As the X-15 neared 65,000 feet, it was diving at Mach 3.93 and experiencing more than 15 G vertically and 8 G laterally, which inevitably exceeded the design limits of the aircraft. The aircraft broke up 10 minutes and 35 seconds after launch, killing Adams. The airframe broke apart at 60,000 feet, scattering the X-15's wreckage across 50 square miles. Having met the United States Air Force qualification for flight in excess of 50 miles, Michael Adams was posthumously awarded the wings of an astronaut. This was the only pilot fatality of the entire 199-flight X-15 program. And yet for years, his name was absent from official astronaut counts, from memorials, from the public narrative of who paid the price during this era. It wasn't until 1991 that Adams's name was added to the Space Mirror Memorial at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, 24 years after he died. Here is what connects all three of these cases, and this is the thing that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the space race. All three programs were operating under the same pressure. Be first, be fast. Do not let the other side know when something goes wrong. The Bondarenko incident had been classified to maintain the image of an infallible Soviet space program amid the Cold War space race. The Nedelin disaster was buried because admitting that dozens of engineers had been incinerated on a launch pad would have handed the West a propaganda victory. And in the United States, a test pilot dying in a hypersonic program did not fit the clean heroic story either. So the names slipped sideways, out of the official count, out of the memorials, out of the history books. The training environments themselves carried risks equal to spaceflight. A sealed chamber with enriched oxygen is as dangerous as a spacecraft cabin. A fueled rocket surrounded by 250 people ignoring safety protocols is a bomb. A rocket plane flying at Mach 5 at the edge of space with degraded flight controls is a spacecraft. The line between training and the mission itself was never as clear as the public was told. And here is the thing that closes the loop from the beginning of this video. The detail that makes Bondarenko's death not just a tragedy, but a systemic failure with consequences that echoed for years. His accident had a profound effect on future design of Soviet manned spacecraft, which avoided pure oxygen atmospheres. The Soviets learned from it, quietly, internally, without telling anyone. So, when NASA was still designing the Apollo command module with a pure oxygen atmosphere, nobody on the American side knew that the Soviets had already paid for that lesson in blood. And in January 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee died in an Apollo 1 cabin fire for the same reason Bondarenko had died 6 years earlier. 3 cases, 3 cover-ups. And in at least one of them, the silence almost certainly cost more lives. A crater on the moon's far side is now named after Bondarenko. A memorial to the victims of the Nedelin disaster was erected at Baikonur and is still visited by officials before any manned launch. Adams's name was added to the astronaut memorial in 1991. They got there eventually. It just took decades longer than it should have. The price of admission to space was paid long before liftoff, in pressure chambers, on launch pads, and above the desert floor. These weren't accidents at the edge of the mission. They were the mission. And the men who died in them deserve to be counted alongside every name on every memorial that space programs have ever built. If you want to see exactly how Nedelin and the X-15 rank among spaceflight's deadliest malfunctions next to Apollo 1, that video is right here.